Alex Callard's 2D character design, and then we've got his 3D character sheet, right? So I'm going to open up the model so we can have a look at this. Again, whenever you texture and design your characters, right now actually if you take a look at the floor, the character's sort of laying on her back, so it should be sort of standing upright. The other thing is when I tend to texture or look at texture, I tend to look at it in flat color or skin shade 4, mainly because a lot of the other materials, if you look, these materials have a color in them, which will then become kind of multiplied against the color you're painting. So if you've actually already painted a bunch of color in a gray material, that's not what's going to export from ZBrush. So again, you want to always check cross-reference with the flat color or skin shade 4, which is one of the reasons I have them laid out here. So to fix this, actually, this might be a good sort of sidetrack, I guess. When you've got multiple subtools, right, it can be complicated because if I grab this one tool and then just try to go to rotate, right, I don't get the other subtools, then I have to try to manually rotate the other tools to get them to match, right? The other thing is sometimes subtools have subdivisions and stuff, and it's not easy to just kind of merge them into one tool, make a change, and then go back. So for that, ZBrush has a system under Z plugin. So it's Z plugin, Transpose Master. So usually we're in version 4R7P3. This version is a little buggy, so you do want to kind of make sure you've got a saved copy of your file, a backup, but you want to go to what's called the Transpose Mesh. Now, transpose in ZBrush basically means that weird move, scale, rotate tool with the kind of movable pivots. So what this plugin does, is when you hit Transpose Mesh, which I just did, it simplifies everything down so that there's, instead of multiple subtools with multiple subdivisions and textures, it temporarily stores that version of the file away, but brings everything down to one subtool. So now we can go to Transform or go to Rotate. If you really want to be accurate, though, I usually go to Deformation and check the rotation here. So this is kind of, I think the pivot's actually also a bit off, so I might just go to Transform and then Set Pivot. So that actually is supposed to sort of set and center the pivot. And now, I believe I want to be, I think, on the Y-axis to rotate the character. I think I'm hitting, actually, offset by accident. Yeah, offset instead of rotate. So I'll go to Y to rotate. Nope. Let's go to X. And if you really want to punch this in accurately, you can just do a numerical entry there. Now, sometimes you notice, and I've mentioned this before, ZBrush is a little strange. You know, it doesn't always work on a scale that that it likes. This character is technically about like 6.5 centimeters high, which is okay. But sometimes you get into trouble where if you take your draw size and it hits a limit, you know, or if it's really, really small, you only have very small increments. I just kind of picked this up the other week, actually. You can check a character size under Geometry. So if we go Geometry, Size, and Position, you can see actually if things are centered in the world or offset. So there is a little button called Unify under Deformation. So you have to expand the Deformation palette. And what Unify does, it will scale the character or a mesh object. It'll scale it down to about a 2 centimeter cube, whatever the maximum height or width or depth is. And that just puts it into a space that ZBrush prefers to work in. Keep in mind, if you're going back and forth between Maya and ZBrush, at a certain point you don't want to be rescaling it. So let me hit Unify, and you will see that it scales the character down and the floor resets. So this is in a scale and a position that ZBrush prefers. And if we take a look at Geometry, the position is like it's at 0, 0, 0. So this is kind of similar to going into Maya and saying, let's freeze the object. Freezing, basically saying, well, wherever the object is in its scale, we're kind of resetting it so that its position's at 0, its scale's at 100%. Again, not always necessary, but I just wanted to point this out. It's a little side note to transpose. But basically, you know, when you want to pose a character, you want to scale it or adjust its position, you know, this is really, really useful. If you need to, let's say, rotate the arm, all right, we can we can actually pose that. And this is, might have been 2 separate meshes. It's not in this case, but if it were, it'd be easy to pose, and we can blur that mask a bit by control tapping, right? So that's the advantage of transpose, is that you can take multiple subtools, bend them, position them, adjust the character. In this case, I really just need to rotate it so it was standing upright instead of kind of on its back. And now I'll go back to Z plugin, and you go from T-pose mesh back to subtools. So before I do that, let me open up the subtool palette so you can sort of see that happen. So Z plugin, transpose master, transpose mesh, back to subtools. So you see it actually resplits the subtools, brings the texture back, and you're going to see it rotate each subtool and put it into position. All right? So really, really useful tool. So that's a minor thing. The other thing is, if you want to start splitting your mesh into pieces or polygroups, sometimes it's useful. So let me just solo this sort of main part of the body here. It essentially has 3-4 colors in this palette. Generally speaking, I would say before doing a remesh, where you create a lower res mesh for this that's more riggable, production ready, I would suggest fixing some of the shape issues that may have been brought up in the notes or in my review. So I would probably fix these boots. I would probably adjust the trim on the shorts and stuff like that. There are some shape issues I'd fix, but for now, I'm going to just skip ahead. One thing you can do, if we've done this kind of mesh blocking and texture or color blocking on the model, you can go to polygroups. This is really interesting. Well, if you want, so this thing kind of has, it looks like I think Alex maybe grabbed some arms from another mesh and sort of stuck them in. The fingers, again, need a bit of shape work, but that's another topic. But what we can do, I can hit Control W here just to reset the polygroup to one giant group. And we can actually do a group from PolyPaint. So it takes your texture data and converts it into polygroups. So if I do from PolyPaint, let me increase maybe the tolerance a bit. Can't quite tell if it's, it doesn't quite look like it's doing it, but. So let me go find out what's going on here. There's polygroups, and we've got PolyPaint. So, and there's no texture here. Now, just so you know, PolyPaint, right? This is basically painting on the model. It doesn't actually give you any exportable. Excuse me. It doesn't really give you anything kind of exportable to Maya, let's say. So. Okay, so I had to increase the tolerance. I'm going to increase it a little bit more and see, but so groups from PolyPaint. So you may have to kind of tweak the slider a bit here to get it to process the different parts. Okay, so the tolerance is actually now a bit too high. So I'll go somewhere in between here. There. So now if I turn off the line, again, you have to click on this tiny little switch on the polyfill option, but so I'll click off of line there. Oh, there we go. And sometimes, I think Alex's paint job was a little bit rough as well. There might be some gaps and stuff, and so that may happen here. You see there's some patches that are maybe left behind, sort of broken up. So you can either try to increase the tolerance or decrease the tolerance, sorry. Or we can do a few other things. I'll talk about that in a second. So let me just maybe drop the tolerance a bit. So that's a little better, right? Now the reason I'm kind of throwing in polygroups right now is so that I can do something a little different here. I'm going to actually just isolate the bottoms of the boots for a second as well. Hit Control W so I can get a polygroup there. So yeah, it looks like he forgot to just fill in the paint job on the bottom of the boot, which gave me a different polygroup. So I'm going to, basically make it a new polygroup for the bottom of that boot, okay? All right, so usually, as I've mentioned before, I typically split heads off from the character mesh, so I would probably isolate this polygroup here. And in this case, since I can't since I can't just isolate, this is sort of connected with the other flesh tone areas. I'm going to hold Control Shift Alt to hide these other pieces. Hit Control W, and usually I'll hit it a couple times until I get a radically different color from some of the other subtools. So at this point, you could simply go to Split and say Split Hidden. So now the head's off on its own. The body will be off on its own. I often will usually prefer to sort of duplicate the main mesh and then start doing any splits that I want. But in this case, I just want to show you something. So I'm going to duplicate this. I'm getting this ready for Z-remeshing. So let me turn the line option back on so we can see that. So remember, we could go Z-remesh, so geometry, Z-remesh, and turn on groups. I'll show you this without it first, so let's just Z-remesh first. So yeah, this thing's Z-remeshed. For the most part, it's probably okay. It is kind of dense. I should have probably adjusted the poly count down as well. It's still really high. I usually prefer the body for anything that you guys are doing, or anything that's sort of a smaller project, TV, commercial-based, or independent film-based, like you guys, short film, independent film. I would suggest 10 to 20,000 polys for the body. And if you can get lower, that's great for the lowest resolution. For the head, same ballpark, 10 to 20,000. So total max is about 40,000. I would ideally recommend 20,000, especially if you plan to have more than 1 or 2 characters. I don't recommend any of you having more than 2 characters in your film. It just becomes a lot to manage, but some people pull it off and pull it off well. So yeah, I just want to show you this. So, you know, this thing is, you know, some things are not really fully defined yet. The sort of cuff of the sleeve isn't fully defined. You know, maybe some of this stuff isn't defined. The other thing that can happen too is that in ZBrush, so I'm switching to the what's called the Zmodeler brush. So that's B, Z for Zmodeler, and then you can hit M on your keyboard. And if I hover over edge loops, I think by default it's there to add insert a loop. You can see here I'm inserting a loop. But if I hold spacebar, I can actually go to delete complete loop. And I always want to check this. Usually you want to go and say, oh, maybe loop by loop. Okay, there's no spiraling. Zremesher is a tool that is great. It gets you sort of 70–80% of the way there. But sometimes, if you notice in this area, if I click on a loop and remove it, it sort of spirals out into other areas. You want to kind of avoid that as much as possible, especially in the legs and the arms. It's not so bad necessarily in this sort of hip waist area, but it's generally speaking something we want to avoid. So I'm going to come back, undo, turn on keep groups. Again, Zremesher is great, but it's not, it saves you a lot of time, but then you still have to spend some of that time you've saved by manually fixing some loops if they're spiraling. So the 2 ways for me to fix that is usually to do a combination of putting in groups and using the Zremesh guides. I'll start with just doing a keep groups, setting my target poly count to 10,000. Usually with these settings, the defaults are actually generally pretty good, but they're not necessarily good in every situation. And your target poly count will never be hit the target. It'll just never happen with Zremesher. So a lot of times you have to either turn off adaptive if you want to get much closer to your actual target. However, I like leaving adaptive density on, because what it does is it looks for areas of higher detail and puts more mesh in those higher detail areas. So it actually is doing a good job generally of trying to keep detail where it belongs. So I usually will kind of compensate for that by dropping the target poly count by about 20–30%. So if I want 10,000, I'll aim for like 7 to 8, and I'll probably get to around 10, probably more like 11 or 12, because ZBrush, right? So I'll let this process for a second. I'll pause the video. Right, so I should, you know, I'm basically getting some better loops around the transition areas from one piece of clothing to another. There are some weird little issues in here. I think there may be some, you know, some group issues. So one thing we can do, I'm going to show you guys another way to sort of do this more manually. So the polypaint thing was great, but not perfect, right? So I'm going to isolate the visibility in this. So I'm going to go to, if you hold Control Shift, it activates the select rectangle brush. So when I hit select Control Shift, you're seeing it's activating this by default. While holding this down, if I sorry, let me just zoom in here. If I hold Control Shift, I can switch the draw type to a lasso, which is what I usually prefer. So I'll hold Control Shift and then isolate those areas. So yeah, this is getting maybe a little bit tricky, but let's turn this off. Yeah, again, just the paint job was unfortunately a little bit messy here, but I'll try to clean up these groups. So what I can do is sort of trim off. So if I go Control Shift Alt and start trimming off, basically what I'm going to do is hide anything that is not the arm. I really try to isolate that arm as best I can. And then make this a new polygroup. But what that'll mean is there'll be polygroups left behind, right? In that in-between area that was once part of the arm or was once part of the sleeve and is no longer. So I hit Control W, now we've got a new group. But as you see, right, we've got these other kind of broken groups left behind. So if I Control Shift Tap here, now my job is to actually Control Shift Alt tap on the other groups. Again, I think I'm going to have to isolate these boots as well. So Control Shift Alt tap to hide those areas and hit Control W. So now that's a new group. Again, let's make sure. So I think that pink area, remember, because all the stuff that was flesh toned was part of the same polygroup, so this is technically still kind of connected to the legs, right? So I'm going to Control Shift Alt tap on that, and I may just use the lasso in this case. There. And so I can also probably, yeah, let's try this. I'll maybe split the shorts from the sweater as well, right? So I'm doing this a bit more based on visibility now than just the polygroups that I grabbed. It was a good starting point, but I just want to get a little more refinement in the groups. So Control W, so now that's one solid group, right? There. So we get, you know, something that's a little better in terms of separation. And even in these legs, for example, there's maybe the socks as well can be sort of split off, right? Okay, so I'm going to just actually let's just isolate the legs. Sorry, I'm just going through and removing the visibility of the other parts here. There. So I'm going to trim away and then isolate. Yeah, I'll isolate this way. Now, one thing you could do as well, one problem that happens is that if you look at Mesh and ZBrush, it actually automatically hides the interior sides of polygons. You can go to, it's near the bottom, Display Properties, and tell it to be double-sided, so you can kind of see inside and out. And if your mesh is flipped, like when we have flipped normals in Maya, you can flip them here, actually. That's what that flip button is for. So sometimes your mesh comes in and, I mean, in 3D it's weird. Most software will show polygons, both the inside technically and the outside. Some software doesn't, like ZBrush, so you have to force it to double-side the display. So yeah, I'll just try to kind of get this on a nice angle so I can really just trim off that last little bit of the legs in relation to the socks there. So you may have to, yeah, shift your perspective a little bit and work on a bit of an angle to just trim that stuff up. Okay, I think that's decent enough. So I'll hit Control W, Control Shift Tap off. All right. Okay, back to geometry. And we'll do a Zremesh. Okay, so Now, what's great about this is you get much cleaner lines, right, along the sort of gap areas in the clothing. It looks like we've got a stray polygroup in here, but so I'll have to maybe undo and fix that. But for the most part, the topology generally flows much, much better through the legs. Again, I set it at 7,000 with adapt on, and it went to 20. Now, one thing you can do, Zremesh a Zremesh. So just say, let's go half the poly count. So you can actually click on half instead of having a target, maybe turn off adapt at this point, and Zremesh again. Right? So now I'm at 9,998 polys. Now there may still be manual editing that has to be done. So I often like to check, like I said, for any kind of crazy looping. So if there is, let's go back to the BZM, the Zmodeler. I've got the delete loop on, so I'm going to just kind of like delete a loop at a time and just sort of test it out. You know, that may get a little hairy in here, and I'm okay with it so far. It's not the worst thing, but usually along the cuffs and stuff here, yeah, so there's a bit of a breakdown here. I think it has to do with the back side of the mesh. I think there's some weird polygroups issues there, but let's see. Yeah, or maybe there's a little bit of looping happening in there. So yeah, it's sort of right in this, localized to this little area. So I'd probably take this into Maya and just fix the loops. There might be, is there some weird splitting there? No. But yeah, usually throughout the legs, it's going to be okay. Throughout the arms, it'll be okay. So I'm just going to do a quick test on this stuff. If you really want more perfect circular loops, let me undo this a bit. I'll step back a couple times. You know, what I often usually like to do is a combo this. So if you, it's good to sort of put loops, especially when you have adapt on, adaptive density, to put loops in the areas that are really going to be important. So like I generally prefer loops around the hips that form in the sort of diagonal fashion, around the knees in a sort of straight linear fashion. And to get a loop that jumps around the whole mesh, you click and drag and then hold shift, and it does an auto loop around the mesh. Not always clean when you're doing a central, like if I do it here, I'm actually going to get potentially a duplicate loop because I'm working in symmetry, and sometimes it's hard to align it, so I often just draw it manually, you know, maybe tracing along certain edges. But so, and remember, if you draw a loop, right, we can draw a loop here. If it sort of stops, well, we can pick it up. If you hover near the end point, it'll turn kind of green, and you can keep drawing and then sort of draw your way through to the back. And then we can put maybe a loop along the hoodie line. And if you don't like it, you can hold Alt and drag across as well. So. And yeah, it's usually good to focus your loops. This is a bit of a problematic design as well. There's a lot of issues that come up when you're working. So in this case, there's a big bulge and a fold right at where the elbow should be. So I'd say you want to either move that up above the elbow so the elbow can freely flex and move and bend without a crazy intersection, or move it down below to maybe mid forearm. So again, you're avoiding that intersection a bit. So there are some things to kind of consider when it comes to you really have to think about motion. What will happen when the knees bend, the hips bend, the elbows bend, and the shoulders bend? So I almost always like to have loops around the sort of shoulders. Again, this doesn't always work because sometimes it'll cut through the whole, or want to cut through the whole mesh. So you may have to kind of go in from the armpit rather than up here while holding shift. So if I go from the armpit and hold shift, there we go. I can kind of get a loop around. Again, it's really touchy. And if I can't just get the shift option to work, I will have to manually draw the loop around. And then always a good idea as well, you can sort of draw a guiding sort of line. So from kind of hip, oops, sorry, I'm drawing with a mouse here and it's a little wonky, but excuse me. So a combination of guides can be really great, and Zremesh. So again, let me set the target to about 8,000. I'll pause the video and remesh. So yeah, like I said, once you get a result, usually I find you have to kind of cut this thing in half. So I'm at about 22,000. I'll turn off adapt and I can Zremesh to half. You can do new guides again and keep polygroups on, because again, you know, this stuff is falling really nicely here, but when I remesh, again, you want to watch for topology that actually doesn't flow with the shapes. So in this case, it's kind of going a little diamond shape through here, right? So you may need to kind of use remesh, and remesh is great. I was watching a video on this over the weekend actually, but a lot of ZBrush artists, rightfully so, say you know, if you're going to be a high-level professional, just Z-remeshing stuff is not enough. You actually need to work on the topology by hand with a lot of other software, whether that's Maya, 3D Max, or something else. So for you guys, this is probably an okay preliminary step, but again, I think I would Zremesh, and then I'd probably go to Maya at this point and start, you know, taking some things out. Also, I tend to look for relatively equal mesh density. So what I mean is, like, I would maybe delete every second loop up here because it's really, really dense. There's a lot of topology there, and so I'd take every second loop out just to simplify things a little bit. And again, make the mesh a little more evenly spaced. And remember, whenever I do this remesh stuff, I'm working on a clone of this or a duplicate subtool, so that if the shape is altered, I can always retain the shape by projecting. I can always transfer the textures back, right? So I'm looking for, sometimes when if I'm testing for looping or spiraling, which ZBrush can do, it's okay if it does this crisscross. Can you guys see this when I click on this loop, or maybe this loop? Sometimes it might go through like the inner leg or something. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's when it spirals, meaning it goes down 3, 4, 5 times as a continuous loop. That's something you'll want to avoid. Just because for UVs, right, if you try to find a seam in UVs, if you try to do something else with it mesh-wise, it's going to be a damn nightmare. This looks a lot better. If we take a look at the boots, right, this is pretty cool. Looks good. So check this out. If you wanted hard edges on your boots now, this is bringing me back to the boot tutorial, and I can show you how to do one from scratch. I'll maybe make a separate video, but this is the beauty of this Zmodeler tool. Again, it's not a full Maya replacement yet, but I think it's getting there. If I hover over polygons, right, and I grab a poly, it doesn't extrude. But again, if I hover over poly, I'm in like polygon, not vertex or edge editing. I can say let's actually do an extrude based on a poly group. Okay, taking everything, not, or maybe the border. Maybe I'll try all. And then if I extrude this out, right, now I've got a little kind of boot shape. If I take this and maybe flatten it, so let me go to I usually actually, weirdly enough, like to use the move tool for flattening. So I'm going to flatten, oops. Let me control tap on that bottom poly group, by the way. So that's, I'm going to isolate that, and then I can flatten it. Okay, so this is the genius of working with polygroups in Maya, in ZBrush, is that it almost becomes a bit of a Maya-like tool. Maybe I'll use deformation and take the size down a bit. Woo. Or yeah, I'll try just a manual edit instead. Let's go move tool, grab the endpoint, sort of scale it a bit. So this is a separate polygroup, by the way, this bottom polygroup. Now if I take this polygroup, if I go back to my brush mode and extrude this, right, now this is kind of the hard edge of the boot. Cool. And if I divide this, hitting Control D a few times, right, now I've got a bit of a loop to the boot. So now granted, I do have a couple extra poly groups in here. So if I want to really make, let's say, this side, so I've divided, by the way, a couple times just to illustrate this. Also, if you go to edge mode, so if I go hover over edge mode, let me just make sure I have no divisions. So I'll delete the higher ones that I just added. But if I, instead of going to delete, I go to crease, edge loop complete. If I crease this and crease this, now when I hit Control D to divide, it gives me a super sharp loop. Now, I wouldn't usually crease. I would actually prefer to bevel instead. So what's the tool? Yeah, bevel, edge loop complete. So that way there's actually 2 real loops. So doubling the loops there, doubling the loops there, because that will actually translate properly to Maya. So now when you hit, again, test it here, Control D, you're seeing that kind of sharp. But again, you know, the boot here has a problem with shape, right? So if I try to, you know, start altering and moving this foot shape, it will pull off at some point that trim or that sole part. So I would tend to save that for later. This is the idea of blocking, right? Big shapes first, then you can get into smaller and smaller refinements, and that sort of boot loop area is a bit of a refinement. So again, and you can just do that in the raw sculpt before even Z-remeshing, right? So this is a really, I mean, as you guys can see, it's a really amazing, fast, powerful way to get a good start and a really decent foundation for your mesh and for your film. Last step here, I'm going to try to wrap this one up quick. So I'm going to turn off the video. Don't crash.
Alright, so that's the only 2 tools now that are visible. I often go into solo mode so I don't see the duplicates, right? But now I'm getting into solo so I can see the 2, and I'll turn it back on. So I want to divide this. So what's going to happen basically is that this mesh has probably 1 million polys. Yeah, about 1 million polys. And I need this new mesh to hit at least 1 million polys to be able to pick up that texture, detail, and information. So it's not only going to project the high-res sculpting detail, but it also projects the color information. So when I hit project all, it's going to say, do you want to transfer the poly paint or the color information as well? I want to say yes. So it's going to snap the shape in. If there's any subtle variations or changes in shape, it'll bring those over to the high-res or the high subdivision of this new base mesh that I've got. By the way, polypaint, the way it works is 1 vertex is equal to 1 pixel. So if you have a texture map resolution of 1K, 1000 pixels by 1000 pixels, that's 1 million pixels, you need 1 million polys. If you have a 16 million poly character, you need, it's going to be a 4K resolution texture, or vice versa. If you know you want 4K, chances are you want to be, you don't have to get to 16K or 16 million polys, but you should get to at least 4, if not 6 or 8 million. It's an imperfect texturing system, but if we take a look, right, from this model to this model, I'm still in solo, it is indistinguishable, right? The difference is this thing has an organized mesh that I can send the low res out, I can rig it, skin it, get it ready for your film. This one, I would not, right? You couldn't skin or rig that. Now, the other cool thing about this, right? So this has raw texture. So even when I go to the lowest subdivision, you know, if I had, let's say if I go to the high res here, I'm going to put a mark on this character. So if I, let's go to the standard brush. And I don't know, I'll just put something on here on the sleeve. So I'm at the highest resolution. Oops, I'm on Z add, so let me just turn that off. I'll go to RGB. And I guess the pressure sensitivity is a little off here for some reason. So I'll put a little mark there, right? So this is what I was saying about the pixel, the vertices acting like pixels. When you step down to the lowest res, this is kind of all you're seeing. This is polypaint. It's polygon painting. You're painting on vertices or polygons. What's cool about this, though, I'll undo that mark. What's cool about this, though, is that we can transfer this to, actually, sorry, let me go back. I'll go back up to the high res. I'll put just a texture that actually has some kind of detail or something really distinguishable on it. So I'll do a drag, and I'll turn off symmetry, just so we can see, right, some really fine pixel detail. Now, sometimes your limit is actually the image itself. I think this is like a 512 image, so that might be why it looks kind of crappy here. No, it's a 128 by 128, so it's really, really low res. So sometimes it's not necessarily the limitation of the mesh that's a problem. It's the, yeah, I'll do a star. That's actually pretty good. Okay, so like I said, this is polypaint, so the texture exists purely on the mesh. But if we want to get it out as a UV, right? Since I've got subdivisions on this character, ZBrush will ask me for sure, do you want a free subdivision? So if I go Z plugin, UV master, this is a little bonus if we want to do UVs.
A lot of times it's a good idea to kind of work on a clone or a copy. So let me go to the low res, Z plugin, work on clone. So it's going to create a clone copy of just the low res, a snapshot of it. Turn on polygroups, unwrap. Because we've got polygroups, it'll give you an unwrap, at least as a starter. If you want to check it out and see what it looks like in the UV editor, ZBrush doesn't have a true UV editor, so you have to hit in Z plugin, UV master, flatten. There's your UVs. And you can unflatten. So I can now copy these UVs, go back to this version, back to Z plugin, paste UVs. Yeah, there's something happening with the boot that's a little destructive there, but so now if I go up to my high res, right, go to UV map, set my texture to 4K. It's usually a good ballpark range to work in. Go to texture map, create from polypaint. So it now converts the raw vertex-based color to a UV-based texture. It's really fast, right? So I can give you guys another more in-depth demo on that, but I just kind of wanted to show you that to see how fast you can kind of go once you get into this sort of making the low-res mesh. Okay, lastly, you know, hair and eyebrows and stuff, they can be treated really, really simply. A couple quick Zremesher guides are fine. The eyeballs you can keep or replace at any point with actual spheres. And the head, we've already covered the head, right? So I don't really need to go too much into depth over that. But if you wanted to, again, you can do guides or even just do a quick kind of raw Zremesh. So duplicate. I'll just try a quick Zremesh here. Let's do, again, I'll aim for 10,000 polys. Maybe I'll try adapt off and then Zremesh. So yeah, my results not good, so I would throw in some guides. And you can also do the polygroup method as well. I find with the face it can often be a little more difficult to get exactly what you want. So I've also discussed or shown you guys at some point there is a topology brush as well, but that's a lot more hand-based, right? Where you're kind of drawing topology directly on the head. Anyway, so I think that's about it.